A platoon of American infantry swept through the hobo woods northwest of Saigon. 28 men, standard formation, standard sweep and destroy. When they stopped for a water break in a clearing, there were 27. Nobody heard a thing. No gunshot, no scream, no struggle. One man had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the earth itself. They found the hole 40 minutes later, a trapdoor no larger than a dinner plate, covered in leaves and packed dirt, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The missing soldier's helmet sat just inside the opening, placed upright, as if he had set it down willingly. His rifle was gone. His body was never recovered. And you know what command told the platoon sergeant when he radioed for guidance? They told him to keep moving. Do not enter the hole. Repeat, do not enter, because the men they had been sending into those holes were not coming back either. And the ones who did come back were never quite the same. They had a name for themselves, a name that started as a joke and became something closer to a death sentence. They called themselves the Tunnel Rats. Armed with a pistol, a knife, and a flashlight, these men crawled headfirst into passages barely wide enough to fit a human body, passages that descended into a darkness so complete they called it the Black Echo. Down there, beneath the jungle floor, an entire invisible war was being fought. A war measured not in kilometers seized or hills taken, but in inches crawled, in breaths held, in the space between a heartbeat and oblivion. You're about to discover why the most terrifying job in the Vietnam War had nothing to do with helicopters, artillery, or napalm. It had to do with a man, alone in absolute darkness, crawling toward something that wanted to kill him. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll understand why the men who survived those tunnels said the same thing over and over for the rest of their lives. You don't come back from down there. Part of you stays. Stay with me. The tunnels did not begin with the Americans. They began with the French. In the late 1940s, during Vietnam's War of Independence against colonial rule, Viet Minh fighters in the Cu Chi district northwest of Saigon started digging. Simple structures at first, short passages carved by hand from the laterite clay, just deep enough to hide a few fighters and a cache of weapons during French patrols. The soil in Cu Chi was ideal for tunneling, a reddish clay with high iron content that held its shape without reinforcement, that could support the weight of tanks rolling across the surface above without collapsing. The Vietnamese fighters recognized what they had, a material gift from the earth itself. By the time the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and expelled from Indochina, those simple hiding spots had grown into something more deliberate. The Viet Cong inherited the network and expanded it with a patience that bordered on obsession. 3-man digging teams worked in shifts, each expected to excavate roughly 3 meters of tunnel per day, using nothing more than hand tools, short-handled hose, and wicker baskets to haul away the displaced earth. The excavated soil was carried to the Saigon River and dumped at night, or scattered across rice paddies where it blended with the landscape. Nothing was left on the surface that might betray what was growing beneath it. By the early 1960s, what had been a collection of scattered hiding spots had become an underground civilization. The network radiating from Cu Chi alone stretched an estimated 250 kilometers, running from the outskirts of Saigon all the way to the Cambodian border. And Cu Chi was not unique. Tunnel complexes existed throughout the country wherever the water table and soil composition permitted. The Iron Triangle, the Hobo Woods, Ben Cat, the Phil Hole Plantation. Beneath the visible war, An invisible one had been under construction for 2 decades. The architecture was extraordinary in its ingenuity. The tunnels descended through multiple levels, typically 3, each separated by watertight trapdoors that could seal entire sections against flooding, gas, or intruders. The passages were deliberately narrow, most measuring roughly 60 centimeters wide and 75 centimeters high, dimensions that accommodated the smaller frames of Vietnamese fighters but made movement excruciating for larger Western soldiers. Every 10 meters or so, the tunnels turned at sharp angles between 60 and 120 degrees, designed specifically to baffle the blast of explosives and to prevent an intruder from firing in a straight line down a corridor. Ventilation shafts, angled to prevent monsoon flooding, rose to the surface through openings disguised as termite mounds or woven into the root systems of jungle vegetation. Some complexes used rabbits or gophers in open-topped cages to bore breathing holes upward, the animal burrows indistinguishable from natural features of the forest floor. Within these networks existed entire underground communities, kitchens with smokeless stoves that dispersed cooking fumes through long horizontal chimneys, dissipating the smoke so gradually that it was undetectable from the surface. Hospitals where surgeons operated by candlelight, armories stocked with captured American weapons alongside locally manufactured grenades and landmines, printing presses that produced propaganda leaflets, command centers where military operations were planned and coordinated. In some of the larger complexes, there were even performance halls where singers and entertainers from Saigon were secretly brought underground to boost morale among fighters who had not seen sunlight in months. Life in the tunnels was brutal for everyone, including the Vietnamese who built them. Malaria was endemic. Captured Viet Cong reports indicated that at any given time, roughly half a unit's fighting strength was incapacitated by the disease. Intestinal parasites afflicted virtually every tunnel dweller. The air was thick, hot, and foul. Soldiers spent days and sometimes weeks underground without ever seeing daylight, emerging only at night to tend crops, forage for supplies, or launch attacks before melting back into the earth. The psychological toll was immense, yet the tunnels provided something no amount of American firepower could overcome. They provided invisibility. When the 25th Infantry Division established its massive base camp at Cu Chi in early 1966, the Americans unknowingly built their headquarters directly on top of the tunnel network. Within weeks, strange things began happening. Helicopter engines were sabotaged during the night. Food disappeared from supply depots secured behind concertina wire. Ammunition was stolen from locked storage. Most disturbingly, American soldiers were found dead in their bunks, killed silently in the darkness, and no perimeter breach was ever detected. The enemy was not coming through the wire. The enemy was coming from below, rising through concealed trapdoors inside the base perimeter itself, striking and then sinking back into the ground before dawn. It was an envelopment from below, a concept so alien to American military thinking that commanders initially refused to accept the evidence. The base was secure. The perimeter was intact. Therefore, the attacks must be the work of infiltrators who had somehow breached the wire. The truth, when it finally became undeniable, was far more unsettling. The ground itself was the enemy. The United States military's first large-scale collision with this invisible world came on January 7, 1966, during Operation Crimp. The 1st Battalion of the 28th Infantry, part of the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One, was conducting a search and destroy sweep through the Hobo Woods. The target was believed to be the headquarters of Military Region 4, the Viet Cong's operational command center for attacks on Saigon. 8,000 American and Australian troops had been committed to the operation, preceded by massive B-52 bombardment that cratered the jungle canopy and shattered every visible structure for kilometers in every direction. The troops landed by helicopter and advanced into the shattered landscape, expecting to find the enemy destroyed or at least disorganized. Instead, they found something bewildering. Small-scale attacks erupted from seemingly random positions. Viet Cong fighters appeared, fired, and vanished before the Americans could bring their superior firepower to bear. Snipers killed soldiers from angles that should have been impossible given the terrain. Patrols reported hearing sounds beneath their feet, muffled voices, the clatter of equipment. But when they searched the ground, they found nothing. Then the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, operating as part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, stumbled onto the truth. Australian soldiers from 3 Field Troop, a combat engineering unit, discovered tunnel entrances hidden beneath the jungle floor. Despite having no training for what lay below, volunteers lowered themselves into the openings. What they found over the following days stunned Allied command. Kilometers of interconnected passages, ammunition caches, medical supplies, radio equipment, and documents, staggering quantities of documents that revealed the scope of Viet Cong operations across the entire region. At a press conference in Saigon following the operation, the Australian commander, Captain Alexander Sandy McGregor, described his men as tunnel ferrets. An American journalist, unfamiliar with the term, wrote tunnel rats instead. The name stuck, and within months it would become one of the most feared and respected designations in the entire war. The problem, as the Americans quickly realized, was enormous. Bombing did not work. Even 750-pound bombs detonating within 50 meters of a tunnel entrance failed to damage the network below. The sharp angles, watertight doors, and multi-level construction absorbed and dissipated blast energy with remarkable efficiency. Flooding the tunnels with water proved futile against systems designed to withstand monsoon seasons. Tear gas and smoke grenades, pumped into entrances by the canister, simply dissipated through the ventilation system or were blocked by the watertight trapdoors between levels. Dogs were sent down, but the Viet Cong adapted immediately. They placed captured American uniforms at tunnel junctions to confuse the animals and washed tunnel entrances with pepper, and captured American soap to overwhelm the dog's sense of smell. That left one option: human beings. Specifically, human beings small enough to fit through passages designed for Vietnamese fighters, brave enough or crazy enough to crawl into absolute darkness armed with almost nothing, and psychologically resilient enough to function in an environment specifically engineered to kill them. Captain Herbert Thornton, a Chemical Corps officer with the 1st Infantry Division, was the man who formalized what desperation had already begun to create. In 1966, Thornton organized a specialized squad within the division's chemical platoon, a team of volunteers whose sole purpose was to enter, explore, exploit, and destroy Viet Cong tunnel systems. The men Thornton sought were a particular breed. They had to be physically small, typically under 5'6", slim enough to squeeze through trap doors and crawl through passages that would trap a larger man. But physical dimensions were only the starting point. Thornton understood that the tunnels demanded something beyond ordinary courage. A tunnel rat needed an even temperament, not recklessness, but a measured calm that could persist in conditions designed to to shatter composure. He needed an inquisitive mind, the ability to read a tunnel the way a tracker reads terrain, to notice the subtle signs that distinguished a dead end from a concealed trapdoor, a stable section from a booby-trapped one. He needed, in Thornton's own assessment, a lot of common sense about what to touch and what not to touch, because one wrong move could end everything in a heartbeat. The equipment was almost laughably minimal, a standard issue, M1911.45 caliber pistol, though many tunnel rats quickly abandoned it. The .45's report was devastating in a confined space, the muzzle blast capable of temporarily deafening and blinding the shooter, leaving him helpless for critical seconds in an environment where seconds meant everything. Some switched to .38 special revolvers equipped with sound suppressors. A few managed to acquire the rare World War II-era suppressed high-standard .22 caliber automatics originally manufactured for the OSS, weapons so coveted that multiple special operations units competed for the limited supply. Others improvised, carrying sawn-off shotguns, .25 caliber pocket automatics, whatever they could find, that balanced lethality against the acoustic nightmare of firing in a concrete hard clay tube barely wider than their shoulders. Beyond the weapon, a tunnel rat carried a bayonet or combat knife, used not primarily as a weapon, but as a probe, a booby-trap disabler, and an all-purpose survival tool. A flashlight, though its use was a calculated risk. Turning it on illuminated booby traps and obstacles, but it also announced your position to anyone waiting in the darkness ahead. Many tunnel rats learned to work in complete blackness, navigating by touch and sound alone, reserving the flashlight for moments when blindness was more dangerous than visibility. A length of communication wire connected some rats to a partner at the entrance, though in deeper systems the wire became an entanglement hazard. Smoke grenades were taped to ankles to be ignited when emerging from a tunnel, so that the mud-covered figure crawling out of the earth would not be mistaken for a Viet Cong and shot by his own comrades. That was it. No body armor, no radio, no backup. One man, sliding headfirst into a hole in the ground, knowing that the darkness ahead could contain anything. The dangers were layered. The Viet Cong had turned tunnel defense into an art form honed over decades. Punji stake traps lined concealed pits along tunnel floors. Sharpened bamboo spikes coated with excrement or toxic plant matter to ensure infection in any wound. Tripwires connected to hand grenades were strung at ankle height in passages where a crawling man could not see them until his fingers brushed the wire. Spring-loaded traps drove sharpened stakes into a man's torso when triggered by pressure or movement. Boxes of scorpions and venomous snakes, the bamboo viper and the crate among them, were rigged to overturn onto intruders who disturbed concealed trigger mechanisms. The Viet Cong sometimes tethered venomous snakes to bamboo frames positioned at head height in narrow passages, ensuring that a crawling man would encounter the reptile face-to-face in absolute darkness. Beyond the manufactured traps, the tunnels hosted their own natural horrors. Fire ants, half an inch long, infested certain sections, their bites raising welts that burned for days. Rats, actual rats, scurried through the passages and sometimes crawled across a tunnel rat's face as he lay motionless in the dark. Scorpions, centipedes whose bite could temporarily paralyze a limb. Bats whose sudden flight could extinguish a flashlight and plunge a man back into disorienting blackness. And then there was the air itself. In deeper sections, oxygen levels dropped to the edge of consciousness. Carbon dioxide accumulated in poorly ventilated chambers. The heat in some passages exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Men passed out from heat stroke and suffocation. One Australian tunnel rat, Corporal Bob Botel, a man of 6 feet tall, who insisted on taking his turn underground during Operation Crimp, became trapped in a narrow passage where his body blocked all air circulation. He suffocated and died. Several of his rescuers nearly followed him, but the most dangerous thing in the tunnels was not a trap or a snake or bad air. It was the enemy soldier waiting around the next blind corner, pressed against the clay wall, breathing as quietly as death, holding a weapon aimed at the only direction his opponent could come from. Tunnel combat was warfare reduced to its most primitive essence. 2 human beings in a space barely large enough to contain one, unable to see, barely able to breathe, killing each other at distances measured in inches. There was no room to dodge, no space to maneuver, no possibility of retreat faster than a desperate backward crawl. If an enemy fighter was waiting around the next corner, the tunnel rat's only advantage was reaction time, the fraction of a second between recognizing a threat and responding to it. Miss that fraction, and the tunnel became your coffin. Tunnel rats learned to fire no more than 3 shots before reloading, because the Viet Cong knew the capacity of American weapons and would rush a man caught with an empty magazine. They learned to use red-lensed flashlights because the Viet Cong used only white lights and candles, meaning a red glow indicated a friendly presence, while a white glow meant the enemy was ahead. They learned to read the darkness with senses that, according to studies conducted during the war, became roughly 60% more acute after a year of underground service. Hearing and smell compensated for what eyes could not provide. A tunnel rat could detect the faint scent of fish sauce or nuoc mam that clung to Viet Cong fighters. He could hear breathing from meters away in the absolute silence of the deep tunnels. He could feel the subtle change in air pressure that indicated a concealed chamber or a trapdoor ahead. The experienced tunnel rat developed a procedure that became almost ritualistic. Before entering, he would sit quietly at the entrance for several minutes, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness, letting his breathing slow, listening for any sound from below. By 1969, most experienced rats would roll a fragmentation grenade into the entrance first, or blow the opening with explosives, accepting the trade-off of alerting anyone below in exchange for at least ensuring the first few meters were clear of booby traps and ambush. Then, the descent. Head first, weapon extended in one hand, the other hand probing the ground ahead like a blind man's cane, fingers reading the clay for tripwires, for the edges of concealed pits, for the telltale smoothness of a recently disturbed trapdoor. Every few meters, a complete stop, listening, smelling, feeling the air move or not move, then forward again, inch by inch, into the black echo. Staff Sergeant Pedro Rejo Ruiz embodied the breed, a wiry Cuban immigrant who had harassed Fidel Castro's communist forces as a teenager before his family fled to the United States. Rejo Ruiz had already cheated death as a mine detector with the 1st Infantry Division before volunteering for tunnel duty. He became obsessed with the theoretical and practical challenges of underground warfare, studying tunnel construction, developing techniques for identifying concealed trapdoors, and deliberately entering systems known to contain enemy fighters, particularly when another tunnel rat had been wounded during a clearing attempt. Rejo Ruiz became known as the human probe, a man who seemed to sense booby traps through some faculty that defied rational explanation. After being wounded in combat, he became a naturalized American citizen during his recovery, then immediately returned to the tunnels. He was one of the few tunnel rats who survived the war with his body and his mind reasonably intact. Sergeant Robert Batman Batten volunteered for 2 additional tours specifically to continue tunnel rat operations. His effectiveness, combined with Rejo Ruiz's, became so notorious that both men were reportedly placed on the Viet Cong's top 10 most wanted list, ranked just below senior American generals. The enemy understood what individual tunnel rats could accomplish. A single skilled operator could compromise months of tunnel construction, uncover intelligence that endangered entire networks, and create a psychological atmosphere of violation and vulnerability among fighters who had believed themselves safe underground. And the intelligence haul was extraordinary. In a single operation, in August 1968, tunnel rats killed 3 Viet Cong fighters and captured 153 more. Throughout the war, they uncovered staggering quantities of material. In one system, 6,000 pounds of rice and 40 pounds of salt. In another, cameras, film, printing presses, and typesetting equipment used for propaganda production. One tunnel rat stumbled across an American M48 tank that the Viet Cong had somehow buried 6 feet underground and converted into a command post. Others routinely discovered hidden artillery pieces, mortars, and ammunition caches sufficient to sustain battalion-level operations for months. The single most significant intelligence discovery came during Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, when 30,000 American troops launched the largest operation of the war, to that point, against the Iron Triangle and the Cu Chi District. It was a massive hammer blow, preceded by B-52 strikes, defoliation of surrounding jungle with herbicides, and the forced relocation of thousands of Vietnamese civilians. Tunnel rats from the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division penetrated the Viet Cong district headquarters of Cu Chi itself. They emerged with 500,000 documents, maps of American bases, detailed records of troop movements from Cambodia into South Vietnam, lists of political sympathizers and intelligence agents operating throughout the country, plans for a failed assassination attempt against Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The find was a strategic windfall that reverberated through Allied intelligence for months. But even Operation Cedar Falls, for all its scale and fury, could not break the tunnel networks permanently. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces slipped back into the area within months. They repaired damaged tunnels. They dug new ones. And in January 1968, they used the Cu Chi Tunnel Complex as one of the primary staging bases for the Tet Offensive, the massive coordinated assault on cities across South Vietnam that shattered American public confidence in the war effort. The tunnels had allowed the Viet Cong to assemble troops, stockpile weapons, and plan the operation directly under the noses of the 25th Infantry Division. The men and material that attacked Saigon emerged, in part, from the same ground that American forces had bombed, gassed, and sent tunnel rats into for 2 years. The tunnels had outlasted everything thrown at them. Perhaps the most consequential tunnel rat discovery came in 1970, when operators uncovered a major signals intelligence node hidden deep underground. Viet Cong code breakers had been intercepting, decoding, and translating every transmission from both the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions. Every patrol route, every operational plan, every logistics movement had been laid bare to the enemy. The destruction of this node immediately made both divisions more effective and dramatically reduced casualties from what had been suspiciously well-planned enemy ambushes. But for every triumph, There was a cost measured in human beings. There were only around 100 dedicated Army tunnel rats in Vietnam at any given time, and the casualty rate among tunnel rat units ran approximately 33%, high even by the brutal standards of Vietnam. Most tunnel rats were wounded at least once during their service. Many were wounded multiple times, and the wounds were not always physical. The psychological toll of tunnel warfare exceeded what any military mental health framework of the era was equipped to address. Tunnel rats operated in conditions that concentrated every human fear into a single experience: claustrophobia, darkness, isolation, the certainty that death could come from any direction without warning, the smell of decomposing bodies, human waste, and stagnant water that clung to skin and uniforms for days, the constant hypervigilance that could not be sustained without fundamentally altering the brain's relationship with fear and calm. Some men had to be physically pulled from tunnels, screaming and crying, suffering complete psychological breakdowns triggered by the accumulated weight of darkness and terror. Others emerged quiet, functioning, but fundamentally changed in ways that would not become apparent for years. After the war, tunnel rats reported inability to enter enclosed spaces. Elevators, closets, small rooms triggered overwhelming panic responses. Nightmares persisted for decades. Relationships fractured because the emotional openness that intimacy required was precisely the vulnerability these men had trained themselves to eliminate. They had learned to become something less than fully human in order to survive underground, and that transformation did not simply reverse when they returned to sunlight. One Marine Corps tunnel rat named Earl Flynn Trimnell, who had joined the Marines at 17, specifically to serve in Vietnam, described the aftermath with painful clarity. Years after the war, he attempted to take a technical course at a college near an Air Force base. Every time aircraft flew overhead, the sound triggered flashbacks so vivid that his instructor's mouth would move, but Trimnell would hear only explosions and mortar fire. He had to drop the course. For years, he refused to acknowledge anything was wrong. He was a trained Marine. Marines did not break. Nicholas Napa Nixanza enlisted in 1971 and was pulled directly from cryptography training into tunnel rat duty. Standing 5'4" and weighing 130 pounds, he was the right size for the job. Trained by a Defense Intelligence Agency warrant officer who had built tunnels in the Philippines during World War II, Sanza learned the underground trade from a man who understood construction from the builder's perspective. Unlike earlier tunnel rats sent down to explore and destroy, Sanza was given a specific and haunting mission as the war reached its final years. American intelligence believed prisoners of war might be held in tunnel systems, and tunnel rats like Sanza were sent to find out. On his first mission near the Laos-Cambodia border in 1972, carrying a silenced point, .38 revolver, a Japanese bayonet, and a bamboo probe stick, Sanza found the remains of American servicemen who had been stuffed into the tunnel network. He would eventually locate the remains of 30 Americans before the withdrawal. Today, Sanza tells his story publicly, but still struggles with the weight of what he experienced underground. According to the Defense POW/MIA agency, over 1,500 Americans remain unaccounted for from the Vietnam War, some of them likely still beneath the earth that swallowed them. The irony embedded in the tunnel rat story is that their greatest achievements were also the source of their deepest trauma. The intelligence they gathered saved countless American lives. The tunnel systems they destroyed denied the enemy critical infrastructure. Their work directly disrupted the Viet Cong's ability to launch coordinated operations, including contributing to the intelligence picture that helped blunt the devastating surprise of the 1968 Tet Offensive, during which the Cu Chi Tunnel served as the staging base for attacks on Saigon itself. Yet the strategic impact was inherently limited. The tunnel networks were simply too vast, too resilient, and too deeply embedded in the Vietnamese landscape to be eliminated by 100 men with pistols and flashlights. The Viet Cong rebuilt damaged sections with astonishing speed. Tunnels cleared and destroyed were often operational again within weeks. The digging never stopped. For every meter of tunnel a rat explored and demolished, Vietnamese laborers carved another meter somewhere else. The tunnel rats were fighting an enemy that regenerated faster than it could be wounded. It was not until 1969 and 1970, when B-52 bombers were redirected from North Vietnam to carpet-bomb the Cu Chi district and the Iron Triangle with delayed fuse munitions designed to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, that the major tunnel complexes finally began to suffer structural damage beyond rapid repair. Giant craters swallowed entire sections. Passages that had withstood years of conventional bombardment collapsed under the sustained weight of strategic bombing. But even then, the tunnels were never fully destroyed. Portions remained operational until the fall of Saigon in 1975. The men who went down into those tunnels understood the mathematics of their situation. They understood that strategic victory underground was probably impossible, that the network would outlast them, that they were applying pressure rather than delivering a killing blow. Yet they went down anyway, day after day, mission after mission, into the black echo. There is something in the tunnel rat story that resists comfortable categorization. These were not men who charged machine gun nests or stormed beaches. Their courage was not the explosive, adrenaline-fueled variety that lends itself to cinematic treatment. It was a slow, grinding, intimate form of bravery, the courage to lower yourself into a hole knowing that everything below you has been designed to kill you, to crawl forward when every instinct screams retreat, to function with precision in an environment where a single moment of panic means death. The tunnel rats built a culture around this shared ordeal. They maintained an unbreakable code that no rat, wounded or dead, would ever be left inside a tunnel. They adopted a motto in mock Latin, non gratum anus rodentum, which translates roughly to not worth a rat's ass, a phrase that captured both the self-deprecating humor and the grim awareness that they were expendable men doing a job nobody else would volunteer for. They gave up alcohol, tobacco, candy, and chewing gum, not for health reasons, but because the strong sense could betray their position in the chemical stillness of the underground. They trained themselves obsessively, developing techniques and passing knowledge to new rats the way craftsmen pass trade secrets. Touch this. Do not touch that. Listen for this sound. If you smell that, turn around immediately. They whistled agreed-upon tunes when emerging from tunnel openings, because a mud-caked figure crawling out of the ground looked exactly like an enemy fighter, and more than one man had nearly been shot by his own comrades in the confused seconds between underground and daylight. The legacy of the tunnel rats extends far beyond Vietnam, though often without proper recognition. Modern military doctrine for subterranean warfare, which became critically relevant during operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the ongoing challenge posed by tunnel networks in multiple conflict zones around the world, draws directly from the lessons learned by those first reluctant pioneers in the Ku-chi district. The emphasis on specialized training for confined space combat, the development of purpose-built equipment for underground operations, the psychological screening protocols for soldiers assigned to subterranean duty, all trace their origins to the improvised methods of men who were making up the rules as they went, learning from each tunnel they entered and teaching what they learned to the next volunteer who would take their place. The Vietnamese perspective adds a dimension that Western accounts sometimes overlook. The Viet Cong who defended those tunnels were not faceless adversaries. They were men and women who lived for months in conditions as brutal as anything the tunnel rats endured, who suffered malaria and parasites and the slow psychological erosion of endless underground existence, who watched 45,000 of their comrades die defending the networks over the course of the war. Captured Viet Cong fighters reportedly expressed a particular respect for tunnel rats, recognizing in them a courage that resonated with their own experience of choosing to fight in the most inhospitable conditions imaginable. According to some accounts, tunnel rats captured alive in the tunnels received better treatment than regular American prisoners, a grudging acknowledgment from one group of underground fighters to another. Today, the Ku-chi tunnels are a memorial park and tourist attraction. Visitors crawl through widened, illuminated sections of the original network. They view recreations of booby traps and underground living quarters. They fire AK-47s at a nearby shooting range. The experience is managed, sanitized, educational. What it cannot convey, what no reconstruction or guided tour can transmit, is the reality of being in those tunnels when they were not a museum, when the darkness was complete, when the air was poison, when the thing waiting around the next corner was not a mannequin, but a human being with a weapon and the will to use it. The tunnel rats knew that reality. They carried it in their bodies and their minds for the rest of their lives. Some found ways to integrate the experience into lives that continued after Vietnam. Others never fully returned from the underground. The Black Echo followed them home, surfacing in nightmares, in panic attacks triggered by enclosed spaces, in the inability to trust the ground beneath their feet. There were perhaps a few hundred men across the entire war who served as dedicated tunnel rats. A few hundred out of the millions who served in Vietnam. Their names do not appear on most monuments. Their specialty was never officially recognized in military occupational codes. Their contribution exists in the classified after-action reports, in the intelligence halls that saved lives above ground, in the tunnel systems that were denied to the enemy even temporarily, and in the memories of the men who went down into the dark and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, came back up again. One veteran, looking back decades later, offered an assessment that carried more weight than any official report. He said the tunnel rat's job was not really about the tunnels. It was not about the intelligence or the weapons caches or the enemy killed underground. It was about something simpler and more terrible. It was about looking into a hole in the ground that promised nothing but suffering, and going in anyway, because someone had to, and you were the one who was small enough and brave enough, and perhaps foolish enough, to say yes. The men who made Comrades disappear did so from below. The men who went after them did so on their hands and knees. In the arithmetic of war, it was a match-up that should have been impossible. A man with a pistol against an underground fortress. Yet they went, again and again, into the Black Echo, into the dark beneath the jungle, into the tunnels where part of them would stay forever.